For the best experience, put on your headphones and listen closely. Some things are only heard in the silence of the night. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. Ghosts, spirits, hauntings, it was all just make-believe, right? But something happened to me last year that shook my understanding of reality to its core. It happened at a McDonald's of all places, and even now, I still can't explain it. If you're a skeptic like I was, just listen closely. By the end of this story, you might change your mind. If you find yourself holding your breath at any point in this story, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you're ready for more tales that haunt the night, subscribe to Dr. Scary Tales for new videos every week. It was late, around 11:30 p.m., and I was starving after a long shift at work. You know that kind of exhaustion where you feel half dreaming, like everything around you is slightly out of focus? That's where I was at. The McDonald's near my place was one of those 24-hour ones, so I figured it was my best bet for a quick meal before crashing into bed. As I walked into the building, something felt off. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint right away, but it was like the air inside was heavier than outside, almost stifling. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting an unsettling yellowish tint on everything. The place was nearly empty, except for an older man sitting in the corner, slowly stirring a cup of coffee. But what really struck me was the silence. McDonald's is usually filled with the sounds of frying oil, the beeps of machines, and the murmur of late-night customers. But here, nothing. I could only hear my own footsteps and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I approached the counter, and after an uncomfortable pause, a young woman appeared from the back to take my order. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with this vacant expression like she was trying to remember how to speak. "You guys still open?" I asked, forcing an awkward laugh. She blinked, her eyes widening just a fraction before nodding stiffly. Yeah, we're open. What do you want?" It was weird, sure, but I didn't think too much of it at the time. I was tired, and honestly, all I wanted was a burger and to get the hell out of there. As I stood there waiting for my food, I found myself staring out the window. The parking lot was completely empty, but the streetlights flickered in an erratic rhythm, casting these strange, elongated shadows that seemed to stretch far beyond what was natural. I don't know why, but it made me feel small, like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone or anything watching me. Finally, the girl handed me my bag. Her hand was shaking slightly, and I noticed her eyes dart toward the corner where the old man sat. I couldn't shake the feeling that she wanted to tell me something, but instead, she just stood there in silence and waiting for me to leave. I sat down at one of the tables, feeling too exhausted to even walk the short distance back to my apartment without eating first. The old man was still there, stirring his coffee slowly, his spoon clinking against the ceramic mug in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. I tried to ignore him, but there was something unsettling about the way he never once looked up. He just kept stirring over and over again. What do you think? Have you ever experienced that strange feeling when someone's watching you, even when no one's there? If you've got a story like that, drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear it. I tried to focus on my food, but my appetite had disappeared. There was this creeping sense of dread that had settled in my stomach, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The buzzing from the light seemed louder now, like it was drilling into my skull. Every time I glanced at the girl behind the counter, she was staring at the old man. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. I should have left right then, but I didn't. Instead, I sat there, listening. That's when I noticed something. The noise from the kitchen, the beeping, the sizzling had stopped. Dead silence, no sound and no movement, just the clinking of the old man's spoon. I glanced over at him again. He wasn't stirring his coffee anymore. In fact, he wasn't even holding the spoon. His hands were resting on the table, palms up, fingers splayed, like he'd been caught mid-gesture. His eyes, though, they were fixed on me now, and they weren't blinking. I stared back at him, frozen. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation. But there wasn't one. His gaze was locked onto mine, and the longer I looked, the more I realized something was wrong, terribly wrong. His eyes were too dark, too deep, like there was nothing behind them, just emptiness. I quickly glanced back at the counter, but the girl was gone. The entire McDonald's seemed to shift, like reality had warped around me. The lights flickered again, casting long, twisting shadows across the floor. A sudden sharp clang echoed through the restaurant, like metal scraping against metal. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing. Just the old man, still sitting there, staring, his head now tilted slightly to the side. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the very atmosphere around me had thickened. I couldn't breathe right. I couldn't move. Are you feeling that too? That creeping sensation like something's wrong, like something's watching you? If you are, maybe hit pause and take a breather. But if you're ready to keep going, suddenly the old man stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, like someone testing out limbs they hadn't used in a while. His chair scraped loudly against the tile floor, and the sound was almost unbearable in the heavy silence. He didn't say anything. He just stood there staring at me, and I couldn't take my eyes off him. My body screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot. Then he started to walk, not towards the exit, but towards me. Each step echoed, painfully loud in the empty restaurant. My pulse quickened, panic rising in my throat. I pushed my chair back, the legs screeching against the tile, but I still couldn't move. It was like my body was paralyzed by fear, completely betraying me. He was almost at my table now, just a few feet away. His face, God, his face, it had started to change, and his mouth stretched unnaturally wide, his eyes sinking deeper into his skull, becoming these hollow black voids. And then, just as his hand reached out for me, the lights went out. Pitch black. I heard my own breath, ragged and panicked, but I couldn't see anything. The only sound was the rapid pounding of my heart, each beat thundering in my ears. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling as I finally managed to turn on the flashlight. The old man was gone, but the door to the kitchen, it was open now, and from the darkness beyond, something was moving. I could hear it, something dragging, shuffling, coming closer. I ran. I don't even remember getting up, but suddenly I was outside, gasping for air under the flickering streetlights. The McDonald's behind me was dark, silent. And when I looked back, the girl was standing at the window, just staring out at me. If that story left you with a chill, go ahead and hit the like button. And if you're feeling brave enough for more, subscribe to Dr. Scary Tales for new stories. Have you ever experienced anything like this? Share your story in the comments below. And remember, some things are better left in the dark. And as if that wasn't enough, there's another story that I can't get out of my head, one that happened not too far from here. This one takes place in a completely different setting, an abandoned McDonald's. Yeah, you heard that right. Not some old haunted house or remote forest cabin, but a McDonald's that was left to rot on the edge of a dying town. And it's not one of those shiny new ones you see on the highway. No, this one's been shut down for at least a decade. Maybe longer. I didn't even know places like that existed anymore. Fast food chains just don't disappear like that, but this one did. I had to see it for myself. It was late again. Something about the stillness of the night pulls you into these places, as if the darkness itself is whispering, "Come closer." Just a little more. This McDonald's stood on the outskirts of a small town that had long since lost its charm. Most of the buildings were boarded up or falling apart. The streets were cracked and overgrown, and the few streetlights still standing flickered lazily, like they didn't even care if you got lost in the shadows. The McDonald's was perched at the end of a crumbling strip mall, its once bright yellow arches now dull and rusted. The windows were dark, smeared with grime, and the front door was chained shut with a heavy padlock. A faded closed sign hung crookedly in the glass, as if someone had left it there in a hurry. The whole place had a strange, suffocating vibe, like the air was thick with dust and memories. But here's the weird part. People talked about this McDonald's like it was some kind of local legend. Stories floated around about why it shut down so abruptly, though no one could seem to agree on the details. Some said the place had a gas leak that forced the owners to close it overnight. Others swore it was because of a string of bizarre accidents, workers getting injured in strange ways, customers disappearing from the parking lot without a trace. And then there was the rumor that something darker had happened inside, something that no one talked about anymore. I wasn't there out of curiosity or thrill-seeking. I had a personal reason. My uncle used to manage that McDonald's before it closed. He was always a quiet guy, but after the place shut down, he stopped talking completely. He moved out of town, cut ties with everyone, and vanished from my life. My mom told me it was depression, that he just couldn't cope with the sudden closure and the financial hit. But there was always more to it. I could see it in her eyes whenever she mentioned him. There was something she wasn't telling me. That's why I was standing there, alone, at nearly midnight, staring at the decaying building. I needed answers. As I walked toward the back of the building, I noticed something strange. There was a door, one of those heavy metal emergency exits, but unlike the front entrance, it wasn't chained shut. The paint was peeling off in jagged strips, and the handle was scratched, like someone had tried to open it. My stomach tightened, but I reached for the handle anyway. It turned easily. I wasn't prepared for what I saw inside. The inside of the McDonald's was a time capsule. The tables and chairs were still there. The booths lining the windows were covered in a thin layer of dust. Old promotional posters for the McRib and Happy Meals still clung to the walls, their edges curled and yellowing. The smell hit me first, stale, damp air mixed with something faintly rotten. It wasn't overwhelming, just enough to make my skin crawl. I stepped inside, letting the heavy door close behind me with a dull thud. The sound echoed unnaturally in the silence, like the building had swallowed it whole. My footsteps were muffled against the grimy tile floor. As I moved deeper into the restaurant, I felt this bizarre, oppressive weight settle over me. It was like the air itself was pushing down on me, thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. I moved toward the counter, where the cash registers still sat, the screens blank and dusty. Behind them, the kitchen was dark. The stainless steel equipment was dull and lifeless. But something about the space behind the counter felt wrong. Like I wasn't supposed to be there. Then I heard it. A faint shuffling sound, like footsteps, coming from the back. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought it was just my imagination. The place had been abandoned for years, after all. But the sound came again, closer this time, soft, slow, deliberate. Someone or something was back there. I should have left. I should have walked out of that door and never looked back. But I didn't. I had to know what was back there. I moved around the counter and stepping cautiously into the kitchen. The shuffling sound stopped the moment I crossed the threshold, and the silence that followed was unbearable. I felt like I was being watched, but every time I looked around, there was nothing, just the cold, empty kitchen. And then I saw it. A door at the far end of the kitchen, slightly ajar, with a faint light spilling through the crack. The light was flickering, like an old fluorescent bulb on its last leg, casting long, distorted shadows on the floor. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the door, even though my brain was screaming at me to turn back. As I got closer, I noticed something carved into the door frame, a symbol I didn't recognize. It was jagged and rough, like it had been scratched in haste. My hand hovered over the door handle, my pulse quickening. I pushed it open. The room beyond was small and dark, lit only by the flickering light in the corner, but it wasn't empty. There was a figure standing in the middle of the room, their back to me. At first, I thought it was a person, someone who had broken in, or maybe a homeless guy taking shelter in the abandoned building. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it wasn't human. It was my uncle. He was standing perfectly still, his hands hanging limply at his sides, his head slightly bowed. His clothes were filthy, his hair matted, but there was no mistaking it. It was him. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step forward, my mind racing. How could he be here? He had disappeared years ago. He was supposed to be living across the country, far away from this place. "Uncle," I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. He didn't move. And then slowly his head turned, but not like a normal person would turn their head. It twisted at an unnatural angle, his neck cracking loudly as his face came into view. Except it wasn't his face. The skin was gray, stretched tight over his skull, and his eyes, God, his eyes were hollow black pits, like someone had scooped them out. His mouth hung open, slack and empty, but there was no sound, just silence. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, trapped by the sheer horror of what I was seeing. My uncle, or whatever that thing was, took a step toward me, his movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. I don't remember how I got out of there. One moment I was in that room, staring into the void where my uncle's eyes should have been. And the next I was outside, gasping for air in the cold night. The McDonald's stood silent behind me. The door I had entered through now firmly shut, as if I had never been inside. I wanted to believe it was just a hallucination, that my exhaustion had played tricks on me. But I know what I saw. And when I looked back one last time, I saw something or someone watching me from the window. A dark silhouette standing perfectly still in the dim light of the abandoned building. It looked just like him. What do you think? Have you ever encountered something that wasn't supposed to be there? Something that made you question your sanity? Share your experience in the comments if you dare. And as if that wasn't enough, there's one more story I need to tell you. One that's haunted me ever since I heard it from a friend. It happened at a McDonald's, but this one, it wasn't abandoned. It was still open, still running. But what unfolded there, it's something no one can explain. This particular McDonald's was located on the outskirts of a small, quiet town, a place most people drive through without a second thought. It sat just off the highway, surrounded by fields that stretched into the distance. Nothing but empty space and the occasional flicker of headlights in the distance. It was the kind of place that felt isolated, even during the day. At night, it was like the world forgot it even existed. The parking lot was never full, just a couple of cars here and there, the glow of the golden arches barely cutting through the fog that often rolled in off the fields. Inside, the place was clean but worn, the tables a little chipped, the seats a little faded, like the place was stuck in time, somewhere between being modern and something from decades ago. It was late, probably close to midnight. The air outside was thick, humid, making everything feel heavy. A storm was brewing on the horizon. The occasional rumble of distant thunder breaking the quiet. I'd gone there to grab a late-night snack, something to keep me going after a long drive. The place was mostly empty, save for a couple sitting in the back and a lone worker behind the counter who looked half asleep. I didn't think much of it as I ordered, but when I took my tray and sat down, something felt strange. At first, it was just the normal late-night diner vibe. I sat near the window watching the storm clouds gather, feeling the tension in the air before a downpour. I was tired, road-weary. You know the feeling. Your eyes burn a little and your mind feels fuzzy, like you're not fully there. I hadn't been sleeping well for days. Too much stress at work, too many miles behind the wheel. I unwrapped my burger, trying to focus on the food, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that eerie silence that had settled over the place. The couple in the back hadn't moved since I'd walked in. The man was slouched forward, his head resting in his hands, while the woman just stared at her phone, her expression completely blank. I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't really present. The worker behind the counter seemed off too. He hadn't moved from his spot, leaning against the soda machine, eyes half closed like he was about to fall asleep standing up. Occasionally he'd glance over at the couple in the back, but there was something in his look, a kind of nervous tension, like he was waiting for something to happen. I tried to brush it off as just the oddness of a late-night shift, but the longer I sat there, the more I felt it, the weight in the air, the pressure building around me. It wasn't just the coming storm outside. It was like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting. Then something happened that shook me. The lights flickered. Not just a small flicker like you'd expect before a storm, but a deep, unsettling flicker that made the entire restaurant feel wrong. When the lights came back on, everything seemed just a little off. The shadows in the corners of the room looked darker, deeper, like they were creeping in, and the buzzing of the overhead lights seemed louder, more aggressive. That's when I noticed the couple. The man who had been resting his head in his hands was now sitting upright, staring straight ahead. His face was pale, drained of all color, and his eyes, they didn't seem right. There was no focus in them, no light, just two dark voids staring blankly into nothing. The woman hadn't moved, but her phone, which had been off, was now flickering with static, like an old TV with a broken signal. I could feel my heart rate spike, but I told myself it was just the fatigue, that I was imagining things. I took a deep breath and tried to focus on my food, but the sound, there was a sound now, a low hum, almost like a growl, coming from somewhere in the back of the kitchen. It was faint, but persistent, like something alive was back there, waiting just behind the stainless steel doors. I glanced at the worker, expecting him to do something, maybe check the kitchen, but he just stood there, staring at the soda machine, his back to everything. It was like he didn't even hear it, or worse, like he was trying to pretend it wasn't happening. The hum grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the floor. I felt it in my bones, this deep, unsettling tremor. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow moving across the far wall. It wasn't cast by anything I could see, but it was there, shifting along the wall near the bathrooms, slow, deliberate. It moved like something crawling, something that didn't belong. I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the table as I watched it. It didn't make sense. There was nothing that could have caused that shadow. No light source, no object, nothing. But it was there, unmistakable, slithering along the wall like it was alive. Then the couple in the back moved, both of them at once. In perfect synchronization, they stood up, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor. The sound echoed through the empty restaurant, unnervingly loud. But their movements were wrong, too stiff, too mechanical, like they weren't in control of their bodies anymore. They started walking toward the counter, toward the worker who still hadn't moved. Each step was deliberate, slow. Their blank eyes fixed ahead. I could feel the panic rising in my throat, my instincts screaming at me to get out. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, but watching as the couple reached the counter. Why, they didn't stop. They kept walking, right into the employee like he wasn't even there, passing straight through him as if he were made of smoke. The worker didn't react, didn't even flinch. It was like he couldn't see them at all. I wanted to shout, to scream, but my voice was gone, trapped somewhere deep in my chest. The couple continued walking, straight toward the kitchen, their eyes never leaving that vibrating door, and as they disappeared into the darkness, the lights flickered again. This time, they went out completely. The only light came from the storm outside, flashes of lightning illuminating the room in bursts. The hum from the kitchen had stopped, replaced by something else, a voice, a deep, raspy whisper coming from all around me, though I couldn't make out the words. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me. I needed to leave. I had to get out, but as I turned toward the door, I saw it. In the reflection of the window, there was something standing behind me, a figure, tall and thin, its limbs too long, too twisted. It was just a shadow in the glass, but I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran for the door, bursting out into the rain-soaked parking lot, the storm crashing down around me. But as I reached my car, I glanced back at the restaurant, my heart hammering in my chest. Through the rain, through the flashing storm, I saw them, the couple, standing at the window watching me, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. And behind them, that shadow, taller now, darker, filling the room with its impossible presence. I don't know what it was. I don't know why they were there or what they wanted. But one thing is certain, I'm never going back to that McDonald's. Have you ever had a moment where you felt something watching you? Maybe even something you couldn't explain? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes the things we can't see are the ones that stick with us the longest.